Hi, I'm Jacqueline Stewart. I'm 42 years old, a registered nurse by profession. But more than that, I've been the steady hand caring for my father during his last, most vulnerable years. For nearly 5 years, my life has been anchored here, on the old family ranch in Montana, a place that holds memories and heartache in equal measure. The ranch itself is a sprawling, weathered piece of land that's seen better days. Much like the man I cared for, our family's roots run deep here. The ranch was my father's pride and joy in his younger years, a place of hard work, quiet mornings, and the kind of rugged beauty that's humbling. But after decades of relentless toil building a multi-million-dollar business empire in Chicago, Dad's presence here grew quieter, the ranch almost forgotten. When his health began to fail, I left behind my life in Seattle, putting my nursing career on pause to come home. It was never a question for me. The ranch, with its creaking wooden fences and dusty barns, became my world. I was determined to be there for him, the way no one else seemed willing to be. Despite everything I sacrificed, my career, my time with my children, even my own mental and physical health, being here meant something more. I was his nurse, his confidant, his daughter. The memories of his smiles on good days, the quiet moments when he'd reach out his frail hand for mine, those moments kept me going through the long nights of worry and endless care. It was exhausting, isolating, and yet, it was love. But family. Family was complicated. My brother Michael, older by 3 years, always seemed to live in a different world. While I was here, battling the loneliness and the hard work of caregiving, Michael built his life in Chicago. He's the charismatic businessman, the golden child, the one Dad boasted about at family dinners, the empire builder. Our family gatherings were tense, charged with unspoken rivalries and comparisons. Michael's presence filled the room like a spotlight, while I felt like a shadow lurking in the corners, trying to blend in, avoid the barbs disguised as jokes or concerns. Just last week, at one such dinner, the tension boiled over. Michael wasn't subtle. With that smirk he wears when he thinks he's winning, he called the ranch a forgotten relic, a dismissive jab aimed squarely at me. "Should have picked a better inheritance, Jackie," he said, loud enough for half the table to hear. The room went quiet. I swallowed the sting, forcing a smile, but inside, it knotted my stomach. It wasn't just the insult. It was the way it implied that everything I did here was worthless, that my years of sacrifice meant nothing because the ranch wasn't a towering skyscraper or a sleek office downtown. I guess that's always been the story of my life. The quiet supporter overshadowed by the flashy success story. The daughter who stayed behind, while the son inherited everything Dad built. I've tried to keep the peace, to smooth over the cracks that run deep in our family, but sometimes, the silence between us screams louder than words ever could. The ranch creaks in the wind outside, and I hear the familiar rustle of the leaves, the distant call of a hawk. This is my reality, a place some see as forgotten, but to me, it's a testament to endurance, love, and unspoken battles. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I'm not invisible. Not anymore. The rift between Michael and me wasn't something that appeared overnight. It was woven into the fabric of our family life from the very beginning. Growing up, Dad's eyes always lit up when Michael talked about his latest business idea or school project. "That boy's got an instinct for numbers," Dad would say proudly, clapping Michael on the back, his voice thick with hope and expectation. Meanwhile, I was the one who quietly tidied up, helped with the smaller chores around the house, and kept the peace, as Mom would sometimes tell me. My efforts were never celebrated. They were simply expected. While Michael was groomed as the heir to the family empire, taken to business meetings, introduced to influential contacts, and praised for his charm and intelligence, I was gently nudged into the background. "Jacqueline, we need you to be steady, dependable," Dad once said during a rare moment alone. "You're the glue that holds this family together, even if it's not in the spotlight." Those words felt more like a consolation prize than genuine praise. I wanted to be seen, to matter beyond the background noise. When Dad's health started to decline about 5 years ago, the divide only grew deeper. I made the decision, without hesitation, to move back to the ranch and care for him full-time. The ranch was a far cry from the bustling city life I'd built in Seattle, but I didn't think twice. I knew Dad needed someone present, someone who wouldn't just manage his medications, but also sit with him during the long, lonely nights, listen to his stories from when he was young, and remind him that he wasn't alone. Being there meant everything to me. Michael, on the other hand, visited sporadically, if at all. His calls were often brief, filled with the usual business chatter or excuses about how busy he was. I remember one afternoon vividly. Dad was dozing in his favorite armchair on the porch, the sun casting golden hues over the worn wood. Michael showed up, his suit impeccable, and his phone glued to his ear. He barely glanced at Dad before muttering, "Looks like you're playing nurse again," with a smirk. It wasn't even a question. It was a dismissal, a way of belittling the care I gave. The sting of those words echoed long after he left. At family dinners, the dynamic didn't change. Michael dominated conversations about stocks, acquisitions, and the future of the company, while I was expected to smile politely and steer clear of business talk. If I tried to mention the ranch or Dad's health, the room would grow cold, or Michael would cut me off with a sarcastic remark. "The ranch isn't exactly the empire, Jackie," he'd say, his voice dripping with condescension. The subtle power plays left me shrinking inside, questioning whether my sacrifices were even worth acknowledging. It wasn't just Michael, even Dad, who was often too weak to discuss anything beyond his medications, seemed to have resigned to this family hierarchy. Whenever I expressed frustration or a yearning for recognition, Mom would gently remind me, "Your father's proud of you in his own way, honey," even if he doesn't say it. But those words never felt like enough. I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe Dad's praise of Michael was his way of encouraging him to succeed, or perhaps the ranch was simply less glamorous in this modern age. But the truth was harsher. Favoritism wasn't just a passing phase. It was entrenched. The family had a clear order, and I was at the bottom. The daughter who gave up her career, who stayed behind to care for a dying man, was invisible. Yet, despite feeling overshadowed, I never stopped trying. I believed that love and duty would eventually bridge the gap between Michael and me, that if I kept being there, kept doing what needed to be done, the family would see my worth. Little did I know then how deep the divide would run, and how the quiet expectations placed on me masked a long-standing pattern of disregard and dismissal. Now, as I look back on those years, the memories are bittersweet. I remember the heavy silence at the dinner table, the strained smiles, the unspoken resentments that simmered beneath polished facades. The ranch, with its weather-beaten fences and overgrown fields, became not just a place of care, but a symbol of how much was overlooked, how much was taken for granted. And through it all, I learned that sometimes, no matter how much you give, recognition isn't guaranteed, especially when you're standing in the shadow of someone else's success. But understanding that divide, naming it, was the first step toward reclaiming my own story. I gave up a promising nursing career in Seattle to be Dad's primary caregiver, managing his medications, appointments, and even handling ranch repairs. It wasn't an easy decision. Seattle had become my home. I had a steady job at a respected hospital, colleagues I admired, and a life that felt full of possibility. But when Dad's health took a serious downturn, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my life, my home, my routines, and yes, even the quiet dreams I'd held on to, and moved back to Montana. The ranch, with its weathered barns and dusty roads, wasn't just a place. It was where my father's spirit lingered, and where he needed me most. The early days were relentless. Mornings began before dawn, waking Dad gently to take his medications on schedule. I learned to read the subtle signs of his pain or confusion, anticipating his needs before he could voice them. Some days he was lucid and grateful for my company. On others, the illness clouded his mind, and frustration would flare in his eyes. I became his nurse, his guardian, and often, his only companion. I balanced administering his medications with managing countless medical appointments, coordinating visits with specialists in town, arranging transportation, and meticulously tracking his health records. Every pill, every dose, every symptom was logged in a notebook I kept religiously. It was exhausting work, but I embraced it because it was love in action. Beyond the medical care, the ranch itself demanded attention. The sprawling property was vast and unforgiving. Fences sagged under years of neglect. The barn roof leaked in several places. The tractor needed repairs more often than I like to admit. I wasn't a rancher by any means, but necessity pushed me. I learned to fix broken gates, patch holes in the cattle pens, and keep the water flowing to the livestock. Each morning I'd walk the fields, checking on the cattle and the land, trying to keep the ranch alive even as the man who once tended it was slipping away. The physical labor grounded me, even as it reminded me of all I'd sacrificed. Sacrifice was the word that hovered over those years. I missed work shifts that could have advanced my career, turned down continuing education opportunities, and put aside my own health. Nights were often spent awake, sitting beside Dad's bed when pain or restlessness struck. I remember the way his voice would soften in those moments, the fragile grip of his hand in mine, the quiet expressions of gratitude he sometimes whispered. Those moments were a balm to my weary soul, even as they took a toll on my body and spirit. Mark, my husband, was my rock through all of it. He never once questioned my choice to stay. When I felt overwhelmed, he'd take the kids out for the afternoon or handle the household chores so I could breathe. Our children, too, grew up with a different kind of childhood, one shaped by the rhythms of the ranch and the shadow of Dad's illness. Family dinners often revolved around updates on Dad's condition or plans for the ranch's upkeep. There were moments when I sensed their own frustrations, the sting of feeling caught between worlds. Yet they understood that this was where I needed to be. Their quiet support was a lifeline. But no matter how much I gave, it seemed invisible to others. Michael, my brother, rarely acknowledged the weight of what I was doing. He'd show up sporadically, polished and busy, and make comments that cut deeper than he realized. "Playing nurse again, huh?" he once said, as if the years of constant care were some trivial hobby. When he talked about Dad, it was about business, profits, expansions, legacy, not the daily struggles of keeping a dying man comfortable and loved. His world was the skyscraper offices of Chicago. Mine was the creaky farmhouse and the endless Montana skies. Family dinners were a minefield. Michael's sharp jabs about the ranch being a forgotten relic or a nice hobby for a nurse stung, but I tried not to react. I played the role I'd been assigned, the quiet, supportive sister who didn't rock the boat. Inside, I battled feelings of resentment and hurt, but I held on to hope that Dad's will would finally acknowledge the years of devotion I poured into his care. I clung to the belief that love and sacrifice would not go unnoticed, that in the end, family would see me, not just as the caretaker, but as a daughter deserving of respect. Looking back, I realize how much I sacrificed, not just my career, but the recognition and validation I craved. I masked my exhaustion with smiles and dutiful nods, pushing through the isolation and unspoken judgments. Every medication I administered, every fence I repaired, every sleepless night I endured was a testament to my commitment. And yet, beneath it all, I silently wondered, was it enough? Would my family ever truly see me for who I was beneath the caretaker's apron? Or was I destined to remain in the shadows, my sacrifices dismissed as insignificant compared to the empire Michael inherited? The ranch, with its weather-beaten gates and twilight silence, held my hopes and my heartache. It was more than land. It was the stage for all the sacrifices I made and all the battles yet to come. I was here, giving everything I had, waiting for the family to recognize what I'd truly earned. The day of Dad's funeral felt like walking into a storm I had long been bracing for, but never quite prepared to face. The church was filled with relatives, neighbors, and friends, all gathered to honor the man who had been larger than life in so many ways. Except, it seemed, in the quiet world I inhabited on the ranch. The air was heavy with grief, but beneath it lay a current of tension that I could almost taste, like metallic bitterness on my tongue. I sat near the front, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, heart pounding as the pastor spoke softly about Dad's virtues, his business acumen, his drive, his legacy. The words felt distant, echoing off the stained glass rather than warming the room. When the time came for family members to share their memories, I listened as Michael stood up, his voice confident and clear, flawlessly delivering a tribute that painted Dad as an unstoppable titan of industry. People nodded and murmured in agreement, eyes shining with admiration. Then came his barb. As if rehearsed, Michael glanced in my direction, a glance sharp and cold, and with a quiet but cutting edge said, "If you cared more, maybe Dad would have had a better empire to leave you." The room stiffened, a cold silence following his words like a sudden chill. People exchanged glances, some masking their discomfort, others barely concealing their smirks. I felt the blood drain from my face, a hot flush creeping up my neck, but I forced a smile, trying to maintain composure. My throat tightened as I swallowed the lump of humiliation lodged there. That moment was more than just an insult. It was a verdict. My years of caregiving, the sleepless nights, the constant presence at Dad's side, it was all dismissed as if it were nothing more than playing nurse, a frivolous hobby compared to building a business empire. Michael's words echoed in my mind, twisting the knife deeper. If you cared more, as if love and care could be measured by dollars and deals. At the reception afterward, the atmosphere remained strained, almost brittle. Groups formed and reformed, conversations filled with polite condolences but tinged with unspoken judgments. I overheard whispers, family members speculating on my choice to stay at the ranch instead of pursuing a career, some casting it as a sacrifice made out of stubbornness or failure rather than love. "She always did prefer the quiet life," one aunt murmured, loud enough for me to catch. Another relative shook his head. "Could have done more for Dad, but she chose a hard road." Even Mom, who always tried to keep the peace, seemed hesitant to speak up on my behalf. Her eyes searched mine across the crowded room, flickering with a mixture of sadness and uncertainty. When I approached her, she gave a tight, polite smile and said softly, "You did what you thought was right, Jackie. Your father loved you for it." But her words felt fragile, like they might shatter under the weight of the afternoon. I spent the rest of the day playing the part I'd grown accustomed to, the dutiful daughter, composed and serene on the outside, while inside, a tempest raged. The sting of Michael's words burned, but what hurt even more was the silence that followed, the lack of defense, the absence of acknowledgement from those who should have stood by me. The invisible line was drawn clear, and I was left on the wrong side of it. That evening, as I returned to the ranch, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows over the fields, I felt the full weight of what had happened. The old barn creaked in the breeze, and the distant hoot of an owl seemed to echo my loneliness. I thought of Dad, frail and fading, and how I had been there in every quiet moment, unseen and uncelebrated. The ranch, with its cracked fences and worn floors, seemed to mirror my own bruised spirit. In that silence, I realized something painful but undeniable. Family wasn't the refuge I hoped it would be. The people who should have been my allies had instead become spectators to my erasure. Michael's dismissal wasn't just about the ranch or the inheritance. It was a declaration that my love and labor counted for nothing in the currency of our family. And yet, beneath the hurt, a fragile ember of something else began to glow, a stubborn resolve not to be invisible any longer. The day's humiliation planted a seed, a question that kept returning. If I was worth so little to them now, what would I do to claim my worth on my own terms? The night deepened around me as I sat on the porch, the ranch bathed in moonlight and quiet. I clutched the worn blanket Dad had used in his last days, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of loss, not just of a father, but of the family I thought I knew. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Things could not stay as they were. The faint rustling of the wind through the pine trees whispered promises of change, and deep inside, I knew I was no longer willing to be dismissed, no longer willing to accept invisibility wrapped in polite smiles. The battle for recognition, for respect, not just from my family but from myself, was only just beginning. Weeks passed after the muted sadness of Dad's funeral, but nothing could prepare me for what came next, the reading of his will. I knew the stakes were high. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that the years I'd spent by his side, the nights spent patching up fences as much as tending to his failing health, would be recognized in some meaningful way. I clung to those hopes like a lifeline, but reality was about to shatter them. The day of the will reading arrived on a chilly autumn afternoon, the kind where the wind carries a sharpness that cuts through the heavy silence. The family gathered once again in the same stately law office downtown, a place awash with polished wood and leather chairs, lined with shelves of legal tomes that seemed to mock the simplicity of my ranch life. We all sat stiffly, trying to mask the tension that buzzed beneath the surface. Michael, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, wore that familiar, confident smile, the kind that always meant he expected to win. Daniel Miller, Dad's long-trusted lawyer, began his solemn recital, his voice steady, but burdened with the weight of what he was about to reveal. As he read through the initial clauses, distributions of stocks, company shares, real estate holdings, I felt a hollow pit forming in my stomach. The words seemed to blur, a numbing hum drowning out the sounds in the room. Then came the part that crushed me. Michael was to inherit the entire business empire, the multi-million-dollar conglomerate Dad had built from the ground up. Every office, every contract, every penny of the company's vast wealth was his. And then it was my turn. I was left with the old ranch, the very land I had fought to maintain, the place where I'd sacrificed so much of myself. Alongside that, a modest trust fund that barely scratched the surface compared to what Michael was receiving. The disparity was stark, unforgiving. The word inheritance felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of how differently our father's legacy was divided. Not in money, but in value and recognition. I caught Michael's eyes across the room, and what I saw made my blood run cold. His smirk deepened, the arrogance radiating off him like heat. Later, he'd call me, his voice dripping with condescension, each word a calculated barb. Should have taken better care of him, Jackie. Even now, replaying that call in my mind, I can hear the sneer in his tone, the cruel satisfaction that came with dismissing everything I'd done as worthless. Mark and the kids overheard the conversation, their shocked silence matching the disbelief I felt. It was a moment that stripped away any illusions of family loyalty, leaving only raw, exposed hurt. That phone call was more than an insult. It was a declaration of how deeply undervalued I was. Years of sacrifice, untold nights of vigil, the physical and emotional labor of caregiving, reduced to a punchline, a lesson about who deserved what. Michael wielded his inheritance not just as a prize, but as a weapon, a way to assert dominance and belittle my efforts. I remember sitting in the quiet of the ranch that evening, the walls seeming to close in around me. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the creaking floorboards, and the familiar scent of hay and earth mingled with the bitter taste of betrayal on my tongue. My hands trembled as I clutched a faded photo of Dad and me from better days, his smile warm, eyes full of love. Did he really mean for this to be my legacy? A run-down ranch and the echo of a brother's scorn? Tears welled up, blurring my vision, but I refused to let them fall. I whispered to the empty room, I gave everything, and this is what I get? A deep ache settled in my chest, a mix of grief and disbelief that twisted into numbness. It was as if I'd been erased, relegated to the background of a family drama written without me in mind. The weeks that followed were a blur of forced smiles and tight-lipped conversations. At family gatherings, Michael's jabs became more pointed, his disdain dangling like a sword over me. Maybe next time you'll think twice before choosing the easy life on the ranch, he quipped during one tense dinner, eyes glittering with malice. The room stiffened, the air crackling with silent alliances and unspoken resentments. Mark held me close one night as I lay awake, the weight of betrayal pressing down like an avalanche. You did more than anyone could have, he whispered. Don't let him define your worth. But even with his words, the sting of rejection lingered, a constant companion in the quiet hours. My children sensed the tension, their innocent questions piercing my armor. Why does Uncle Michael say those things, Mom? My youngest asked, eyes wide with confusion. I forced a reassuring smile, but inside, I wrestled with the same question. How could the brother who shared my blood be so blind to the truth of my sacrifice? The ranch, once a place of solace, now felt like a battleground of whispered judgments and invisible scars. Every broken fence post, every weathered barn door seemed to echo the gulf between what I had been promised and what I was given. The land held my memories, but also my growing resolve, not just to endure, but to be seen, to be heard, to reclaim the dignity stripped from me. It was in those long, lonely nights that a fire ignited within me, a flicker of defiance against the injustice inflicted by blood and law. If the family wouldn't honor my sacrifice, I would find a way to honor it myself. The pain carved a path toward something new, a determination not to be sidelined anymore, to stand tall despite the shadows cast by Michael's empire. The future felt uncertain, the path ahead tangled with conflict and doubt. But beneath the hurt, a stubborn ember kindled, a promise that I would not let this betrayal define me. The ranch might be run down, the trust fund modest, but the worth of my love and labor was immeasurable, and I was just beginning to understand what that truly meant. That night, the house was silent, except for the soft creaks and groans of the old ranch settling under the weight of the evening. I sat alone in the dim glow of the kitchen light, the clock ticking steadily on the wall, marking time in a way that felt painfully deliberate. My hands held a steaming cup of tea, but I hardly tasted it. My mind was a whirlwind, replaying every moment, every word, every slight that had built up over the years, with Michael's mocking voice echoing loudest of all. I remembered the calls he never returned, the messages that went unanswered when I needed support. How many times had I reached out, only to be met with a curt, "I'm busy," or worse, silence. There was a pattern to it, a slow erasure of my presence from his life, and by extension, from the family narrative. It was as if my existence, my sacrifices, my loyalty, were invisible unless they served his agenda. Then came the countless sacrifices I made, turning down career advancements, missing my children's school plays, spending sleepless nights by Dad's bedside managing his pain and confusion. I thought those sacrifices would make me indispensable, respected, maybe even loved. But instead, they were dismissed like trivial inconveniences, turned into jokes or weapons. Michael's barbs disguised as humor, playing nurse, the ranch relic, should have taken better care of him, were daggers coated in sarcasm, designed to cut deep without leaving obvious wounds. The weight of all those years pressed down on me now, heavier than any physical burden. The grief I felt for Dad was still raw, but now it was tangled with a fierce anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Anger at the injustice of it all, at the family who watched silently as I gave everything and then turned their backs, at Michael, whose smirk and smug words made it clear he never saw me as anything but a failure, an embarrassment, not a daughter worthy of respect. In the quiet, I saw the truth in stark relief. Michael had never truly valued me. Not really. His affection was conditional, based on usefulness, appearances, and legacy. I had been the family's unpaid nurse, the background character in their story, the forgotten daughter who cleaned up after everyone's messes. My devotion had been taken for granted, my presence treated like a shadow cast by the bright spotlight shining on his success. For years, I had held on to the hope that love alone would bridge the divide between us, that my sacrifices would eventually earn me a place beside him, in Dad's eyes and in the family. But those hopes were illusions, fragile as glass, and just as easily shattered. The family I thought I belonged to was a house built on favoritism and neglect, where loyalty was a one-way street and love was measured in dollars and deals. Now, the fog of denial was lifting. I realized I owed them nothing. Not respect, not forgiveness, not even acknowledgement. I didn't have to carry the weight of their judgments or their cruelty. I was tired of being the family's emotional crutch, their silent support system who got nothing but sneers in return. I was done shrinking, done apologizing for choices made from love and duty. In that moment, the anger gave way to a quiet resolve. I would no longer let my worth be dictated by their eyes. I would reclaim my dignity on my own terms, with my own voice. Michael needed to understand that cruelty has consequences, and that I was no longer willing to be invisible, to be the scapegoat or the punchline. The ranch outside was cloaked in moonlight, serene and steadfast, much like the resolve building inside me. It was a reminder that what I was fighting for wasn't just property or money. It was respect, recognition, and justice. The years of sacrifice deserved to be honored, not mocked. As the night deepened, I felt a shift within me, a transformation from grieving daughter to determined woman ready to set boundaries and demand what was rightfully mine. The path ahead wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. I was no longer willing to let them define my story or my worth. The fight for respect had only just begun. I started quietly, almost cautiously, as if dredging up those dusty papers and old receipts could somehow undo the years of neglect and dismissal. The ranch deeds were the first. Those worn documents that had been buried in a leather-bound folder on Dad's cluttered desk. I found them in the back room, tucked beneath stacks of unopened mail and faded photographs. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly smudged from time, but every signature and stamp was a key, a piece of proof that the ranch was more than just a forgotten relic. It was a tangible, legal asset, mine to protect. But I knew the deeds alone wouldn't shift the power balance. My brother's empire was vast, complicated, and shielded by layers of legalese that I barely understood. So I turned my attention to Dad's will. It was a thick, weighty document that Daniel Miller, Dad's longtime lawyer, had kept safe. I had been reluctant to ask, afraid of what I might find, but now I needed clarity and ammunition. I pored over every page, line by line, searching for anything, any hidden clauses, codicils, or amendments that might tilt the scales in my favor. The more I read, the more I noticed subtle hints, phrases that suggested Dad's intentions might not have been as straightforward as Michael had portrayed. There were references to care during illness and maintenance of family legacy, vague enough to be overlooked but pointed enough to suggest some recognition of my years of devotion. My heart pounded as I realized there could be more to the story than the cold, final distributions we had heard in that sterile office. The receipts were the quietest but most personal evidence. I began gathering every piece of paper that documented the money I had poured into the ranch, repairs for the broken fences, the new roofing shingles, the vet bills for our cattle, even the fuel for the tractor. Each receipt told a story of sacrifice, of patches applied with my own savings, often taken from the modest funds I'd saved for my children's education. These weren't just expenses. They were proof of my commitment when Dad's empire was miles away, and Michael was too busy to care. I approached Daniel Miller with this growing pile of documents and questions one chilly afternoon. His office felt imposing, filled with leather-bound books and polished wood, symbols of the very system I was about to challenge. Daniel was a man of quiet professionalism, always measured and impartial. But today, I saw something else in his eyes: respect, a hint of surprise, maybe even sympathy. "Jacqueline," he said carefully, spreading the papers across his desk, "your father was a complicated man, and his final wishes reflect that complexity. There are indeed clauses here that are often overlooked, but they carry weight, particularly the provisions tied to the care of his health and stewardship of the ranch." His words were both a relief and a spark. For years, I'd felt invisible, like my sacrifices were a background noise no one wanted to hear. But this was different. This was validation, in the form of legal language, of the devotion I'd shown. Daniel explained that some of these clauses could challenge the current division of assets, especially if we could prove that Michael had unduly influenced Dad during his illness. He mentioned the possibility of a constructive trust, or even contesting the will if the evidence supported that Dad's intentions were manipulated. As we talked, a strategy began to form, not just a desperate grasp at fairness, but a calculated, deliberate plan. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was becoming a steward of truth and justice. I realized that Michael's power relied heavily on family goodwill and his untarnished public image. If I could bring these hidden truths to light, if I could show the court and our family the reality behind the empire, it might force him to reckon with the consequences of his cruelty. Behind my calm exterior, a fierce determination galloped like a wild stallion. I was ready to pull back the curtain, to expose what had been hidden in plain sight. I began organizing everything meticulously, legal documents, financial records, photographs of the ranch's condition, and notes from the years I cared for Dad. This wasn't just paperwork. It was my story, my truth, and my shield. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with confrontation and heartbreak, but I also understood that silence had been my enemy for too long. Now, armed with facts and the support of a lawyer who believed in fairness, I was preparing to stand up, not just for a piece of land, but for my dignity, my legacy, and the recognition I had been denied for so long. As I filed the last document into a neat folder, the Montana wind whispered outside the window, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The ranch might look worn and tired on the surface, but beneath it lay roots as strong as any empire. Roots I was determined to protect and prove were worthy of respect. The quiet gathering of these papers was more than a legal exercise. It was the first step in reclaiming my place, my name, and my inheritance in a family that had long tried to write me out of the story. I started pulling back, inch by inch, like a tide receding from the shore, leaving behind a shoreline that had once been crowded with voices, but was now quiet and exposed. The first thing I did was stop answering Michael's calls. They came in waves, business updates, thinly veiled jabs, or cold reminders of how the ranch just isn't the same without you. I let every call go to voicemail. When I finally listened, the words stung less because I was no longer vulnerable to the interruptions or the rehearsed charm. Silence became my shield. I also began limiting the financial support I'd been quietly providing to Mom. For years, I'd been covering her medical bills and helping with household expenses, small amounts here and there that I deducted from my own savings. It was something I did out of love, out of a sense of responsibility. But after everything, including Michael's cruel remarks, I realized I needed to protect my family too, especially my children, who deserved security and stability. So I sent Mom a gentle letter explaining that I would no longer be able to provide financial help. Not because I didn't care, but because I had to take care of myself and my own family first. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, typing those words and pressing send, knowing it might widen the fissures in a family already cracked by resentment. Refusing to attend Michael's business events was another deliberate choice. The invitations had come steadily since the will reading, cocktail parties, shareholder meetings, gala dinners where his success was toasted, and my name was a whispered afterthought. In the past, I had gone out of a sense of duty, trying to keep the peace, trying to remind myself that maybe, somewhere under the surface, the family could still be whole. But now, each event was a reminder that I was viewed as the other sibling, the one who inherited a relic, not an empire. So I stopped going. I sent polite regrets, and watched as the quiet ripples of my absence stirred conversations I wasn't part of. Behind these actions, I changed passwords on shared digital accounts, email, family financial portals, even the online access to the ranch's utilities. For years, Michael had held keys to every door, physical or virtual. He'd made decisions, sometimes without consulting me, about the ranch's management, dismissing my input as sentimental or outdated. Taking back control was symbolic, but necessary. It wasn't just about security. It was about reclaiming agency over the part of the family legacy that was mine. I set up new passwords and updated contact information, ensuring that now, I was the gatekeeper of my own affairs. At the same time, I revised my own estate plans. I'd never thought much about it before. Family seemed like a constant, a given. But now, with the raw reality of inheritance and betrayal laid bare, I realized that protecting my children's future was paramount. I met with a local attorney I trusted and restructured wills, trusts, and guardianship arrangements, making sure everything was airtight. There was a quiet power in preparing for the worst, and I embraced it as part of my transformation from a passive caretaker to an active protector. Meanwhile, I quietly filed a petition with the court to investigate the validity of Dad's will. This was the most significant and nerve-wracking step. Daniel Miller had explained the process, the potential challenges, and the timelines. It wasn't just about contesting a document, it was about uncovering the truth buried beneath years of manipulation and family politics. The paperwork was tedious and emotionally draining, But I reminded myself that this was necessary. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting for recognition, respect, and the truth. What surprised me most was how little notice the family took of my withdrawal. At first, there were questions, whispers about my grief, assumptions that I was overwhelmed or taking a break. Michael, ever the strategist, waved it off publicly, even casting my distance as immaturity or bitterness. But behind closed doors, I sensed unease. The control he so confidently wielded was starting to slip, even if he refused to show it. My mother called less often, her voice tinged with confusion and sorrow, as if she wanted to reach across the growing gap, but didn't know how. She asked if I was okay, worried about the silence on my end. I told her I needed space to heal and think, carefully avoiding the full truth, that I was preparing to challenge everything I'd been told about family, loyalty, and worth. Each day, as I locked the door behind me and watched the sun dip over the Montana horizon, I felt the weight of my choices settle like dust on the worn floors. The loneliness was sharper now, but it wasn't defeat. It was a hard-earned solitude that signaled the start of something new, a reclamation not just of property but of self. The ranch might be quiet and weathered, but within me, a fierce resolve burned brighter than ever. The trap was set, though they remained blind to it. I was no longer the invisible daughter or the overlooked nurse. I was becoming a force they couldn't ignore. And that realization, more than anything, made the silence outside feel like the calm before a storm. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy stillness, as if the very air weighed down by the years of silence and unseen sacrifices I carried. The courthouse was imposing, its stone facade cold and unyielding, echoing the rigidity I was about to confront. I clutched my folder tightly, the documents inside a lifeline, proof that beneath the surface of my overlooked life lay undeniable truths. The waiting room buzzed with quiet conversations, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart, steady and resolute. This was more than a legal battle. It was my declaration that my story mattered. When we entered the courtroom, Michael sat smugly beside his attorneys, his posture relaxed, as if the outcome was a foregone conclusion. But I had spent months preparing for this moment, meticulously gathering every shred of evidence that revealed the truth of the empire we both claimed to share. The worn ranch deeds, the receipts for repairs and veterinary bills paid from my personal savings, the carefully kept logs of Dad's care, all these were threads that, when woven together, challenged the superficial narrative Michael had built. Daniel Miller, calm and authoritative, began presenting the case. He laid out the facts with precision. The ranch was not merely a neglected relic, but a crucial asset that had generated profits reinvested into Dad's business empire. I watched as the judge listened carefully, eyes scanning the documentation that clearly demonstrated my financial contributions to maintaining and improving the ranch. For years, I had quietly poured my own money into fencing repairs, roofing, livestock care, essential elements that sustained the land, and, by extension, the family business. Then came the most revealing part, the evidence that Michael had exerted pressure on Dad during his declining health to alter the will unfairly. Daniel presented correspondence, texts and emails, that showed Michael's insistence and repeated urging for Dad to concentrate wealth in his hands, sidelining me and the ranch's value. There was even testimony from a close family friend who had witnessed one tense conversation where Michael dismissed my role as a nuisance, urging Dad to focus on what really matters, the empire's future. But the true turning point was when Daniel disclosed the secret codicil Dad had drafted, hidden away until now, a legal amendment that explicitly recognized the daughter who cared for him in his final years. This codicil granted me a significant share in the business, contingent on proof of my caregiving during Dad's illness. The room fell into a fragile silence as Daniel laid the document before the court, its faded ink a testament to a father's unspoken gratitude finally given voice. Michael's face drained of color, his usual confidence replaced by a flicker of panic. I could see the shock ripple through his entourage. This wasn't just a challenge to his inheritance. It was an upheaval of the narrative he had controlled for so long. The empire he boasted about wasn't solely his. It was connected to the ranch I'd nurtured and the care I had given to Dad. The facade cracked, revealing the uncomfortable truth beneath. When it was my turn to speak, I stood steady, my voice calm but firm. For years, I was dismissed as just the nurse, the sister who chose the ranch over ambition. But the ranch is not just land, and my care was not just duty. It was love and commitment. Dad's empire was built on more than boardroom deals. It was built on the foundation of this land and the sacrifices made here. My words echoed through the courtroom, a quiet assertion of the worth that had been denied for so long. I didn't demand sympathy or apologies. I demanded recognition. As the hearing concluded, I set clear boundaries in my closing statement: respect for my role, acknowledgement of my rightful inheritance, and a firm stance that any future interactions must be grounded in equality and fairness. I could see the unease in Michael's eyes. He realized that the comfortable world he ruled was shifting, and he had to reckon with the consequences of his cruelty. Walking out of the courtroom, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps. The weight I had carried for years felt lighter, replaced by a simmering strength. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I was no longer invisible. The old ranch, battered but enduring, symbolized not just my past sacrifices, but the future I was determined to claim. Behind me, I could almost hear the echoes of Michael's stunned silence, the sound of a legacy being rewritten, one that included me. The fight for respect and justice had taken a decisive turn, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I was ready to face whatever came next. Michael's world unraveled like a house of cards collapsing in a gust of cold wind. The moment the courtroom confirmed what I had long suspected, the very foundation of his carefully crafted empire began to crack. Investors, those distant faces behind phone screens and boardroom windows, started asking questions. Quiet inquiries turned into pointed concerns. If the rightful ownership of the business was in dispute, where did that leave their investments? Was Michael truly in control? Or was this empire a fragile illusion built on shaky family dynamics and unspoken lies? I wasn't privy to every whispered conversation, but the ripples reached my ears through calls and texts from old acquaintances, even some who had once admired Michael's business savvy. "Is everything okay with the Stewarts?" one message read. Another warned, "Be careful, this could get messy." The world that had once seemed so solid beneath Michael's feet was shifting, and he could feel it too. Almost immediately, people who once lined up beside him began to distance themselves. Family allies, those who'd smiled and nodded at his grandiose plans during cocktail parties and shareholder meetings, now spoke in hushed tones. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving, and subtle cold shoulders replaced warm greetings. It was a social exile unfolding in slow motion, each gesture a quiet indictment of his faltering grip on power. And then came the calls. At first, just a few, Michael's voice shaking, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Jackie, please, let's talk. This doesn't have to tear us apart." I listened without replying, heart pounding but resolve firm. The calls grew more frequent, more desperate. Messages flooded my phone, texts laden with regret, emails brimming with contrition. "I was wrong. I never meant to hurt you," one read. Another pleaded, "Can we find a way to fix this? For Mom's sake, for the family." Mark saw the messages and frowned, a silent question in his eyes. I shook my head gently. Some wounds can't be bandaged with words alone. Michael's panic was palpable. I imagined him pacing his sleek Chicago office, hands running through his hair as the empire he once ruled with certainty slipped through his fingers. His usual arrogance had given way to frantic damage control, but the more he scrambled, the more obvious his desperation became. Meanwhile, Mom found herself caught in the crossfire. I could hear the hesitation in her voice during our few conversations, caught between loyalty to her son and the aching truth she could no longer deny. "I want peace," she whispered one afternoon, her tone trembling like a fragile leaf in a storm. "But this is bigger than any of us." I longed to hold her, to tell her it would all be okay, but even I wasn't sure of that anymore. Michael's anger simmered just beneath the surface. When his attempts at reconciliation failed, bitterness took hold. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he lashed out, Sharp words aimed at anyone who questioned him, accusations that I was tearing the family apart. But the whispers of his behavior spread quickly, and social circles that once welcomed him with open arms now watched from a cautious distance. Isolation wrapped around him like a tightening noose. Inside me, a strange mixture of emotions churned. There was no joy in his downfall, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth was finally surfacing. Years of dismissal and cruelty couldn't be swept under the rug anymore. The power he wielded, the empire he paraded, was no longer untouchable, and as his world crumbled, I felt a hardened resolve settle deeper within me. The ranch, bathed in the soft glow of Montana twilight, became my sanctuary, a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling in the city where Michael's empire stood. Here, the creaking fence posts and whispering pines witnessed a woman no longer willing to be sidelined, no longer willing to accept a legacy defined by neglect and scorn. The silence I maintained amid his pleas was my armor. It spoke louder than any argument or confrontation. I was no longer the invisible daughter or the overlooked nurse. I was a force reshaping the narrative, demanding respect not through loud declarations but through steadfast truth. Michael's unraveling was far from over, and I knew the battles ahead would test every ounce of strength I had. But in that quiet moment, as the stars blinked awake above the ranch, I embraced the truth. Sometimes, the fall of one empire makes way for the rise of another, a rise built not on arrogance or entitlement, but on truth, dignity, and quiet resilience. Michael's world was crumbling faster than I ever imagined it could, and the fallout was as relentless as the Montana wind that howled across the ranch at night. The courtroom victory wasn't just a legal win, it was a seismic shift that shattered the carefully constructed illusion of his invincible empire. Almost immediately, murmurs of uncertainty began to ripple through the business community. Investors, once eager to ride the wave of the Stewart name, started to whisper behind closed doors, questioning the stability of the conglomerate Michael claimed to control. I could almost feel the weight of those doubts pressing down on him, even from miles away. The calls I overheard from his office, fraught with tension and desperation, made it clear he was scrambling to hold on to the fragments of his reputation. The polished veneer of confidence he wore at board meetings was cracking, replaced by hurried phone calls and frantic texts to his closest allies. "Is everything really okay with the company?" a voice would ask, skepticism clear in its tone. And with every question unanswered, every hesitation, the foundation beneath Michael's feet grew shakier. The fallout wasn't limited to business. Social circles that once welcomed him with open arms began to close their doors quietly, but unmistakably. Invitations to the exclusive dinners, charity galas, and high-profile events began to dwindle. The subtle coolness of former allies was a sharp contrast to the warmth he'd once commanded, and I heard through family whispers that his usual circle was now a tightrope, each step fraught with uncertainty and suspicion. Meanwhile, Michael's health took a visible toll. The man who once carried himself with effortless ease now looked gaunter, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and worry. I heard from my mother how he stopped eating regularly, how sleepless nights replaced his usual calm demeanor. The stress was no longer just a business problem. It was a physical and emotional breakdown unfolding in slow motion, witnessed by a family that had once turned its back on me. Family gatherings, which had always been a battleground of subtle jabs and veiled insults, became even more charged. The room that once felt cold with tension now crackled with barely contained hostility. Michael's anger simmered beneath the surface, erupting in sharp, bitter remarks aimed not just at me, but at anyone who dared question him. These events, once opportunities to pretend everything was fine, now laid bare the fractures opening wide between us. Conversations ended abruptly, eyes darted nervously, and the veneer of civility cracked like old paint. Michael tried to portray himself as the victim, a ploy to sway family and friends back to his side. He spun tales of how I was tearing the family apart, how my legal games were unnecessary and cruel. Yet with each outburst, his efforts backfired. More relatives began to admit privately that they had overlooked my side of the story for far too long. Some expressed regret, quietly confessing to me that they had dismissed my sacrifices and bought into Michael's narrative without question. Their whispered apologies were small but significant, confirming that the tides were turning in my favor. Not everyone, of course, was ready to accept this new reality. A faction within the family doubled down on blaming me, painting me as the troublemaker, the one disrupting what little peace remained. Those voices were loud and persistent, but their power diminished as community opinion gradually shifted. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, people who knew the story beyond boardrooms and legal documents, began to see Michael's entitlement and my relentless pursuit of justice for what it was, a justified fight for recognition and respect. The community's shifting perception was a quiet but powerful force. I noticed the subtle changes, greetings that were warmer, conversations that carried a tone of understanding rather than judgment. The ranch, once dismissed as a relic, became a symbol of resilience, a testament to endurance in the face of adversity. People admired the work I was doing to restore it, to breathe life back into the land that had nurtured our family for generations. Through it all, I remained steady, documenting every interaction, every sharp word, every attempt to pressure or intimidate me. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about setting a precedent, about standing firm in the face of years of dismissal. The weight of the past was heavy, but with each passing day, I felt my resolve deepen. The fight was no longer just about inheritance. It was about reclaiming dignity, demanding accountability, and redefining what family could mean when respect is no longer optional. The consequences rippling through Michael's life were profound and far-reaching. His business faced the very real threat of foreclosure as investor confidence continued to waver. The financial strain compounded the emotional turmoil, isolating him further from the networks of support he once took for granted. Family dinners that had once been tense were now arenas of silent judgment and strained politeness, the air thick with unspoken accusations and fractured bonds. And yet, amid the unfolding chaos, I found a strange sense of peace. Watching Michael face the consequences of his arrogance wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about making sure that the sacrifices I made, the love I gave, and the truth I carried were finally acknowledged. The road ahead would be long and fraught, but I was no longer the invisible daughter on the sidelines. I was a woman who had risen from the shadows, grounded in the strength of her truth, ready to face whatever came next. In the aftermath, the Stewart family found themselves standing at a crossroads, forced to confront a new reality that none of us could have imagined just months before. The old dynamics, long entrenched and unchallenged, began to unravel, making way for a redefinition of what it meant to be a family, and what respect truly looked like between siblings. I won't pretend it was easy or clean, because family messes rarely are, but slowly, painfully, a new understanding emerged. For me, this wasn't just about inheritance or legal victories. It was about carving out a space where my years of devotion and sacrifice could be acknowledged without apology or dismissal. I realized I needed to establish clear terms for how I would engage with the Stewarts going forward, boundaries centered on mutual respect, accountability, and equality, rather than the old patterns of favoritism and condescension. It was a hard line to draw, but necessary to protect my dignity and the legacy I was determined to uphold. The first step was honest communication. I reached out to my mother, whose heart was caught between two children now divided by more than just money. Our conversations were tentative at first, filled with the weight of unspoken hurts and cautious hopes. I told her I loved her and that I wanted us to heal, but that I needed her to understand how deeply the past had cut. She listened, really listened, and for the first time in years, we spoke openly about the fractures in our family. That dialogue became a bridge, fragile, but real. Michael, on the other hand, remained distant. The humiliation of the court hearing and the fallout from his crumbling empire had silenced his bravado, but I sensed his resentment simmered just beneath the surface. I made it clear that if we were to have any relationship, it would be on my terms, respect my role in Dad's life, acknowledge my rightful place in the family legacy, and treat me as an equal, not a lesser sibling or an inconvenience. Any attempt to undermine or belittle me would result in permanent estrangement. It was as much a protection for myself as it was a challenge to him. Family gatherings became less frequent and less painful. The old dinners, once battlegrounds layered with sarcasm and veiled insults, transformed into more civil, if still cautious, encounters. I found myself more at peace stepping away from toxic interactions, focusing instead on the relationships that nurtured me. My husband Mark, our children, and the close friends who had stood by me through the storm. Their support was a balm to my bruised spirit, reminding me that family isn't just blood, it's the people who choose to honor and uplift you. The ranch, my inheritance in more ways than one, blossomed under my care. Slowly but surely, the weathered fences were repaired, the barns restored, and the fields tended with a renewed vigor that echoed the strength I was reclaiming within myself. The land became a living symbol of endurance and renewal, a tangible testament that what appeared forgotten was, in fact, very much alive. Every morning, when I stepped outside and breathed in the crisp Montana air, I felt a quiet pride in the legacy I was preserving, not as a forgotten relic, but as a foundation for future generations. Michael's downfall was not something I celebrated. It was a consequence of his own choices. The empire he had built with so much swagger now faced uncertainty, and his social circle narrowed as whispers of his arrogance and missteps spread. I held no illusions that he would change overnight. The path to reconciliation, if it ever came, would be long and uncertain. But for me, that was no longer my burden to carry. What I learned through all of this is that respect isn't given freely. It's earned through honesty, accountability, and the courage to stand firm in your truth. Boundaries aren't walls to keep others out, but fences that protect what is precious and define where you begin and end. My story wasn't just about inheritance or family drama. It was about reclaiming my voice and deciding on my terms what family meant to me moving forward. The sun sets over the ranch each evening now with a sense of peace I never thought possible. The wind rustles through the pines, carrying with it a promise, not of an easy future, but of one where I am no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, and no longer willing to settle for less than I deserve. The road ahead remains open, filled with challenges and unknowns, but for the first time, I walk it with my head held high, knowing that true legacy is built on strength, truth, and respect.